Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined-up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. Thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a weekly show featuring interviews with fantastic authors sharing their personal stories on how and why they write. There's hints and tips for aspiring writers and great book reviews from top bloggers. Follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast. Right, cue the cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination goes a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 63, and today I'm bringing you a brilliant conversation I had with William Shaw, author of the excellent Breen and Tozer series of novels set in late 60s London, not to mention a bunch of other contemporary crime thrillers. He's a lovely bloke and the interview is full of inspiration. We've also got another book review in Book Bloggers Corner from regular contributor Catherine Sunderland, aka Bibliomaniac. Before that, a brief mention of the fact that the show is now supported by Audible, which you might have heard up at the top of the show there, which means Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give Joined Up listeners the opportunity to check out their service. And if you've listened to the show before, you'll know I'm a huge fan of Audible and always have an audiobook on the go. And indeed, as I mentioned in William's interview, I've even listened to a couple of his books. And as I record this, I'm just finishing the audiobook version of William's standalone thriller, The Bird Watcher, which again is mentioned in the interview, and I highly recommend it. Thanks to this trial, you can go and get your hands on that right now for free, so head over to audible.com/joined-up to check that out. Other than that, a very quick writing update from me. Got to be honest, hasn't been a very productive week for me at all. I won't bore you with the reasons/excuses for the lack of progress, but it's really brought everything into sharp focus for me this week and it's made me realise I've got to get back into the habit of planning my week ahead and specifically scheduling in my writing time. Like many of you, I've got a very busy day job, this podcast, my family and everything else to fit in, and the simple fact is if I don't plan when I'm going to sit down and work on the novel, then it just simply doesn't happen. So this week has been a bit of a wake-up call, and after a chat with my writing buddy Maria yesterday, we've both made a pact to get our shit together and make ourselves more accountable. One of the ways I'm going to be doing that is using a weekly update on my personal blog over at waynekellywrites.co.uk, so look out for that to keep a track of what I'm up to, and do make sure you prod me if you see me slacking. But how about you? How do you stay on track? Have you got any tips you want to share? Maybe you're struggling too and you just want to have a moan, that's alright as well. So you know the drill, comment on the website, joinedupwriting.co.uk, the Facebook page, or you can drop me a line on Twitter at JUPodcast. Right, I'll stop making excuses for my poor writing week and brighten things up now with this week's interview, a fun chat with William Shaw. So before becoming a crime writer, William was an award-winning music journalist and the author of several non-fiction books, including Westsiders, Stories of the Boys in the Hood, about a year spent with the young men of South Central Los Angeles, and A Superhero for Hire, a compilation of columns in The Observer magazine. The New York Times has called his series of detective books set in late 60s London an elegy for an entire alienated generation, and several of his books have been longlisted and nominated for various awards, including Theakston's Old Peculier Crime Novel of the Year, the Barry Award and the CWA Historical Dagger. It was a real pleasure to chat to William, and I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I did, so let's hear what he had to say. So, William, thanks very much for coming on Joined Up Writing Podcast. How's things?
They're well, yes. I just literally finished one book and written the first sort of paragraph of the next one, so that makes me feel quite happy. Starting something,
Yeah, in the thick of it already, straight back in. So, yeah, it's always that, I suppose there's that, do you sort of get that nervousness before you start the new project, whether you're actually going to be able to do it all again?
Yes.
You and every other writer that I've ever spoken to, I think.
Yeah, I know. It's and then you feel fine for a little while, and then you get to about halfway through and you begin to think, this is appalling. This is really terrible. Why am I doing this? Why does anybody let me do this?
Oh, good. I'm glad I'm not the only
hopefully it comes right.
Anyway, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your latest book, which I think is Sympathy for the Devil. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that and about the Breen and Tozer series in general.
So the Breen and Tozer series was set in 1968-69. I started writing a crime book and realised that it was set in 1968, the first one, A Song from Dead Lips. And I loved writing about that period because I'm very good mates with a writer called C.J. Sanson, who writes historical fiction. Mm-hmm. And he was writing all these sort of deeply historical books. And I was thinking, well, I can't do that. But I kind of thought, what if I write cultural books, if you know what I mean? It sounds very poncy, but what I mean is crime books that had to do with a cultural moment. And, of course, there was so much going on in 1968 and 1969 in terms of youth culture and music and theatre and stuff like that. I thought, I'm going to put my detective in the middle of all that. So I kind of created this detective who was a bit like my dad, who was, like all men in those days, a bit middle-aged by the time they hit 30 and didn't quite get any of it. So the protagonist is kind of at sea in this changing world. And so they've been through various adventures by the time they get Sympathy for the Devil. And, as I mentioned, the cultural thing, well, Sympathy for the Devil is about, well, it certainly opens with the death of Brian Jones, which is one of the great sort of who was he killed or not sort of mysteries of that time. And so I thought I'd riff on that. And so it starts with poor Brian dying in a swimming pool. And it sort of takes off from there. And the detective, in a very tangential way, gets drawn into trying to look into this himself, and it gets tied up with a completely different murder case that he's looking at of a very prostitute. I've tried to avoid killing prostitutes because it's such a cliche in crime writing, but I wanted to say something about that era's obsession with youth. And there was this, so I have this prostitute whose shtick is to dress up as a young girl. And I wanted it to be disturbing because I think the more we're learning about that period, for however wonderful it was in many ways, there were a lot of very disturbing elements about some of the sexuality of that. So it's kind of in that territory. And my detective, in his sort of innocent, wide-eyed way, stumbles into this dark world.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I've recently started the first book, and I love it. I mean, I like all that kind of, probably the same as yourself. I love all that kind of period of history anyway. I say history. It feels strange saying history, like you mentioned your friend that writes historical fiction, and you probably don't consider it as historical fiction, but it is really. It's what, 50 years ago?
Bizarre, isn't it? It's just coming up, and all that stuff's just coming up for the 50 years, isn't it? It's just
it's really strange. But kind of on that thought, it struck me. I'm actually listening to it at the moment. I'm listening to the audiobook of it, and it just struck me that in some ways it is really, really recent history, and in others, especially with how things have moved on, say in the last sort of 20 years particularly, it is a long time ago. And I suppose in lots of ways that's kind of liberating for you because there's lots of things you don't have to worry about, like technology and things like that. I was talking to Melanie McGrath last night about something similar, saying that, in certain instances, one of her characters in a really remote area where there is, hardly any mobile phone reception or anything else. And so she's got legitimate excuse for not having to worry about that. And obviously you haven't got any of that stuff, but then you've obviously got some other limitations with other things, I should imagine. How did you find that?
Well, on the one hand, I find I also write sort of contemporary stuff, and police procedure is so complex now. And who does what at a crime scene is really important. In those days, they stumbled in. In 1968, there wasn't even a proper forensic sort of approach by the Met. They would really just stumble into these crime scenes. And, it wasn't until 69 they really began to sort of work out that they needed a separate unit to do all this. So that gives you great leeway because you can literally have them stumbling up to the corpse and people coming through the crime scene, which gives you all sorts of freedom. I mean, the freedoms you can't have is that, well, it's not really a freedom. It's like I wrote the first draft of A Song from Dead Lips, and then I went and found two women who had served in the same division as I was writing about at the same time. And so I laid out the plot to them and said, is this plausible? And they said, not in the least, because you've got your protagonist driving a car and we weren't allowed to drive cars. and there's so much there. You kind of what?
Yeah,
it's such a different world.
Yeah,
and I had not, I'd imagine there's all sorts of other sort of sexism from the era, but the idea that women police were not allowed to drive just seems so strange.
Well, it's funny because I'm at quite an early point in the book, and I've just passed the kind of point where it's Helen Tozer, isn't it? Your female police officer in it. And basically, your protagonist, for a reason I won't spoil it for people, for a reason he's struggling to drive at the time. And for a start, I was thinking, well, why doesn't she just immediately jump in and say, I'll drive, if she can drive, was the first thing. But then as the scene kind of went on, it dawned on me. I thought exactly the same thing. I thought, well, hang on a minute, it's probably some kind of... I didn't actually think it was about not being allowed to specifically initially before that's revealed. I thought it was more like a cultural thing, and it was like, oh, I'm not going to let a woman drive me around kind of thing, as you say, with the sexist kind of attitudes. And I suppose it's a bit of both. But yeah, there's I should imagine there's lots and lots of things like that to deal with. But there's obviously lots of parallels that you can draw as well, especially with it. I mean, that first book, at least so far, you're drawing a lot on racial tensions, and it's the early sort of the first lot of immigration and stuff that came into the country, and there's all that that's kind of boiling away, which kind of never went away in terms of the tensions and things that's felt in the country now. So do you ever think about that, or is it always story first and then worry about that stuff later and see if you can lay some of that other stuff on afterwards?
That's a very good question, because I think the temptation is always to try and, make it significant. Mm-hmm. And there are so many parallels, and there are those things you want to draw in. And I have done that in some of the books, sort of like there are real parallels, real contemporary resonances about something. But on the other hand, I really try and roll back a bit from saying it myself, because I think it's much better if it's the reader who makes those things rather than the writer. And if the reader doesn't want to, that's absolutely fine. But rather than sort of saying, I've got a very important point to make about immigration at this point, because, I still think it's great to write crime that has real resonances and has real importance, but it's entertainment as well, and I do have to remind myself that's the thing, because it's quite a good playground in real ways. In some ways, that sort of those resonances, but I think you have to be very careful about it and think, your first duty is to write a cracking story.
So you touched on it there. You mentioned you obviously you were lucky enough to find a couple of women that worked in that actual unit or that area at that particular time was part of your research. Well, what about the rest of your research? Because presumably, there was a hell of a lot of research. I'm listening to it, and there's loads of great little details in there, right down to what somebody might have in their bathroom cabinet at the time, for example, and it's little things like that. How did you go about that?
Well, I think part of the thing is actually not to have too much of it, and therefore the bits that you notice are the bits that work. So you don't lather on the 60s history on every page, but when you just have one detail, hopefully that works a bit better than trying to get too detailed about it. And I think the 60s are kind of around. You don't have to, every book I've done, I've just found somebody or other from that period and talked to them for a while. People remember imperfectly a bit, but we've got the internet and it's great. I'm not sure, but like on the third book in the series, it's quite a lot about heroin use, and I really didn't know what it would have been like to be a heroin addict in the 60s. Mm-hmm. But actually, I found somebody who set up the first charity that dealt with a lot of that, and talked to her for ages about it. And those people around, and they're not a lot older than me, a lot of them. The young people are getting involved then, so they've still got a memory, hopefully. I haven't, not so far back they don't. So, it's that mixture, and photographs are great as well. I think there's all sorts of photographs, lots of press photographs, lots of agency stuff, which you can just look through and you see something in the background. You think, if I explain about this rediffusion TV, then suddenly you're there. Do you know what I mean? It's that the whole idea. People didn't buy televisions in those days; they used to rent them. Yeah. And just a little detail like that actually takes you back to a different era.
It's everything, really. I mean, I noticed, something about dust. I know it sounds, great. Oh, he's really interested in the things he gets intrigued by. But even things like the dustbin men and the dustbin lorry, obviously, it's different. Everything's, every little thing is different, and it's all those little bits and pieces that just add up to this kind of, atmosphere that you create.
And it's important to then make up the bits you don't know. I mean, I think that's the other thing is you can. I made up in my first one. I've got them living in these things which are, police section houses. Which were, if you're a policeman, you lived in a section house until Margaret Thatcher came along and she decided they weren't really. And she was probably right because they created a sort of really internal weird culture in the police, but she got rid of them. But actually the whole idea of the policeman going home from work and living in the same house together is kind of hilarious dramatically. And you've got this thing. But I couldn't find many accounts from it because it's such an obvious thing at the time, just it was ordinary life.
People wouldn't comment on it.
No, so there wasn't a lot of trace about that. I've since met a lot of policemen who've lived in them who've told me more, but in the first one I was just making it up. But I've had policemen say to me, it was just like that, and I was thinking, well, that's really because I just made it up.
You've just.
And I think you do get resonances of I think if you convince somebody about the world, you convince something about all the things you invent as well. Do you know what I mean? You take some details that are absolutely right, and then you kind of improvise from there, and that can be really good fun as long as you don't get it hopelessly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I think it was Stephen Dunn, another crime writer, doing a talk once and talking a little bit about it, and the kind of way that he often talked about it, particularly with like police procedurals or things like that, was the way that he approached it. As long as he got like 3 things that were like absolutely spot on, and they could be very, very small things, like it might be the colour of the duplicate paper that was used on a report or something like that. As long as he kind of got those right, it was fine. He said you can sell it. Like the rest of it doesn't really matter. They won't pick up, but it's just little things like that you can just put in. And the rest, we're writers at the end of the day, so you use your imagination. And I suspect, you're talking with the specific example of the section house, for you just imagined this blokey culture, these guys, living together, having had worked together all day, and you kind of extrapolated it from there. Yeah,
and it's a lot of fun. And also, I mean, I think the real facts are really interesting. I mean, what Stephen Dunn said was quite right, because what you're doing is you're anchoring people in the real world, then you can make them afraid or worried or anxious. The moment you've anchored them in something real, then you can tease their emotions. But it's that sort of, getting the balance between the two.
Just give them enough, yeah. So tell us a little bit about Cathal Breen, and specifically why you kind of chose, tell us a little bit about his background and why you decided to go that way with it.
I wanted to write somebody rather who was an immigrant themselves, because this book was about immigration. I wanted a white immigrant. The first one, there was a sort of immigrant. I think about it, and I sort of began thinking about who he'd be as a character, and I toyed with him for Polish for a while, Polish for a while, and then actually another writer friend of mine said, no, write about Irish, because my dad was an Irish immigrant from the north. My father-in-law is an Irish immigrant from the south, and I'm constantly around sort of London Irish community, so it was a very good point. I know a lot of people in that community, and it's one I feel quite confident about getting a lot of the details right. And it's that community who came over in the 40s, 50s, 60s, various times when the Irish economy was really doing crap, and they kind of built London, a lot of it. Even in the 19th century, they built London, and so I think if you're writing about London, the London Irish are a really interesting story and the really part of it. So I got him there as this idea because, and also, it allows you to, everybody calls him Paddy, and the casual racism of the time was just there. And I wanted to make that point. I know I was trying to say not wanting to be too heavy about this, but I think one of the great things about all the music and culture is they did change us all. They made us more liberal, and therefore, as a writer, I can play on the liberal stuff in the 60s, because people think the 60s were swinging in 1968, and they weren't. London, tiny bits of London were kind of groovy and fab. Knightsbridge, King's Road, bits of Soho, Carnaby Street, but the rest of it was still in the 1950s. So you've got all these great culture clashes, and so I wanted him to come from a fairly traditional Irish background, and yet be kind of attracted to this younger Helen Tozer, who's definitely from the 60s, who loved the Beatles and gets it, because you've got a great, there's a natural antagonism between the two already. There are, both sides of the generation gap, and it allowed me to use my dad to a certain extent. My dad's sort of vision of the world and a slight suspicion about what was about the individualism and everything that was changing. So I kind of made him this sort of person who was never quite comfortable in his skin, and he'd had a crisis that is relating to the death of his father, and suddenly he's been taken out of work and a bit and things like that, and he comes back and he's suddenly looks at the force he's in slightly more critically. And of course the Met at the time were outrageous. They were a phenomenally corrupt, arrogant force which had to be reformed very strongly in the next decade. So he's suddenly outside that, because you do want that. I know the old thing of the outsider detective, but I wanted to make him an outsider in that sort of perspective of just feeling a little uncomfortable with the way things were heading with the Met. And then he meets this young idealistic policewoman who seems to embody a far more idealistic vision of the world. than his colleagues. And I think he's very attracted to that.
Well, you've got some cracking dialogue as well, although I think you've made it a bit of a nightmare for the poor guy that's had to read out the audiobook. You've got so many accents in there. But it's...
I've never listened to it. I've never listened to the audiobook. Not because I don't... It's just that he might be really good, and I don't want his voice to get in my head.
No. He is good, but like I say, you didn't make his life easy. You've got like a Welsh guy speaking to an Irishman, speaking to somebody from the West Country. So it's almost like he's schizophrenic in some of the scenes. But the dialogue is great. I mean, have you got a specific way that you approach dialogue? Do you tend to read it out loud back to yourself afterwards? How do you go about writing and editing your dialogue?
Well, I love dialogue-based fiction. I really do. And I think it's that thing is that I've got two things about conversations, and this is the kind of the tricks behind it, is that conversations are always adversarial. So if somebody says something, you kind of want the person either to disagree with it in some kind of way or fight back about it. And that makes it's what playwrights do all the time. So if you're just using a lot of dialogue, you try and avoid as much people just sort of follow and saying, yes, let's go to this room. What a good idea. Let's go into this room.
Who cares?
The other person said, let's not go into this room.
Yeah.
And so that's a key thing. But the other thing is that also I was a journalist for many years and transcribed a lot of tapes. And you hear people speaking really, and you're always cleaning up their speech. And then you think, why do I clean up their speech? Why don't I let them speak as people do? And if you put how people speak down, it gives you a real level of realism, I think, because people don't speak as logically as they like to. So you've got to leave all the mistakes in, all the sort of phrases that don't quite work and things like that. And a third thing is that there's a writer called Alan Warner who wrote The Sopranos and Morvyn Callar and things like that, and who I think writes the best dialogue in the world. And I've shamelessly tried to copy that, and the same sort of thing. He writes this, sort of very vivacious dialogue that I really love, and mine's nowhere near on that level. But I just am a great admirer of that kind of thing, that if you can take a scene just with 2 or 3 voices and actually use them to build the scene, I think you can really put the reader in the room with them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and the other thing, especially if you're writing crime, which, by its nature, unfortunately, sometimes can be a bit dour and a bit, dark, for want of a better phrase. It's nice to be able to use that as well to add humour, and there's lots of humour in the book, so far, as and a lot of that does come from dialogue. And
that's good, because you're not trying to make the writer funny. Do you know what I mean? It's the characters who are funny. Because I always get a bit annoyed in crime if the narrative voice is funny, because actually you're going to be dealing with dead bodies and grimness. Yeah. And I think that the narrator's voice, the main, the God character bit of it, has to have no sense of humour to a certain extent. But you can allow your character, if you use that kind of dog, you can allow your characters to be the funny bit and the lightning. You do need a bit of light and dark, don't you? And it makes the dark darker when you've got jokes and things. Absolutely.
And again, I think it's especially if you're dealing with police officers and police crime, police procedurals and things. I think it's realistic. You have got that gallows humour there, and there's also the camaraderie between people doing what is, let's be honest, a very, very difficult job at times, and having to deal with things that most of us don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so that kind of gallows humour and knockabout camaraderie, it just, to me, it adds a layer of realism. I thought it was really good.
That's so completely true, though, isn't it? I mean, it really is. And you talk to any police, they always talk about the people who've retired, that's what they miss. And they talk about it. It's like you're sitting there with the most horrendous, scene, some tragedy unfolding before you, and somebody will say something really funny. You may not laugh, but it's just you die if you didn't have that little bit of relief from it, because it can be a really shitty job sometimes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, completely. So you mentioned there, obviously, talking about dialogue, but you mentioned, obviously, your background in journalism originally. Let's go back a little bit then and talk a little bit about how you became a novelist in the first place. Was it always in your mind that you wanted to write fiction eventually? Or tell me how that came about. How did you become a writer?
Well, I always wanted to write fiction. I just took a very, very long way about it. I like fiction. I was really into music when I was sort of at college, and I went to start writing for magazines when I left college about music. And this was the 80s. There was lots and lots of work in magazines. It's the opposite world to now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And people would pay you, and you could actually walk into an office and say, can I have a job? And people say, yes, please, take a job. We're desperate. Yeah. And it was sort of like that. So I started writing for a sort of punk magazine called Zigzag, and then I was writing for another magazine called Blitz at the time, and I did an article with Neil Tennant and the Pet Shop Boys, and he said, "Can you write for Smash Hits?" So I was writing for Smash Hits for ages and did all that. But all the time I was desperate to try and write fiction, but I didn't really know what I was doing. You know, I think some people, I'm always really annoyed when you meet really young people who've written a brilliant book, because I think it can take a lot of your life before you know what you're actually doing.
Oh, completely. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
So I started writing non-fiction books, actually, partly because I really like the sort of form of American non-fiction writing, the sort of long form narrative stuff that American magazines do so well, and started doing non-fiction books, partly because I like doing that, but partly because I wanted to learn how you publish books and who to speak to. So, that sort of led finally to, agents and all that sort of stuff. And then, failed fiction manuscripts and all that until I finally figured out what I was doing.
Well, I was going to ask you that because A Song from Dead Lips was your first published fiction, but your first published novel. But was it actually the first novel that you wrote? No, not at all, actually. I wrote one quite early on, which I chunked, and I wrote two more that I sent. I had a very good agent called Johnny Geller that I got when I was writing non-fiction stuff, and I sent him two fiction novels. And I thought the first one was all right, but I wasn't convinced it was very good. But I wasn't quite sure what it should feel like when you got to the end of the novel. Do you know what I mean? And I was thinking, maybe he's going to say this is a work of blinding genius. I'll give it to him. And he actually, to be fair, Johnny really liked it, and he did try to sell it. And he's a very good agent. He came back and said, "I can't sell this book. I've had somebody or other who's quite interested, but in the end they didn't. They didn't do it." So I wrote another, and he read it and said, "I'm not going to send this out because it's not good." Right. And he was right. And, the moment he said it, I knew he was right. And I knew the first one wasn't that good. And I knew the second one. I just thought, well, Johnny Geller's my agent. He's absolutely one of the top agents there is. I've got to write this book because otherwise I'll miss my chance. But actually, I know, and I kind of knew when I was sending it in, that it wasn't very good. And it's a really odd thing, and it was kind of literary fiction book. And he said, "Look, I really love your nonfiction stuff. Please, let's do more of that, but leave the fiction aside." And of course, this is heartbreaking. Of course. Yeah. But the other thing is that I think, likewise, if you write, you actually just carry on because that you really, so I had about 6 months, mutter. And then one day I was sitting on a train and I started writing, and I actually wrote the opening scene for A Song from Dead Lips. The moment I wrote that, I thought, well, hey, this is crime fiction. Yeah. Interesting. I hadn't realized. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to write fiction, but I realized it was. And it was incredibly liberating, partly because I love crime fiction. It was always one of my sort of go-to spaces when I wanted, to do that type of reading that I think we all want to do when we want a bit of drive and we want to know that the end of a book's going to happen, and that the crime delivers in all sorts of interesting ways. And I said, wow, that's interesting. And I suddenly realized that I knew exactly what this book felt like and things like that in a way I'd never done because I wasn't sure what the literary fiction was. Do you know what I mean? I think either you've got to just have incredible arrogance, or you've got to really know what you're doing to write a great literary fiction book. Something that you love. I mean, I had a similar. I'm actually working on what I hope will eventually be my first published novel. But I've had similar things. I've written a couple of other manuscripts, and the stuff that I've written before the novel that I've got now wasn't literary fiction, but I've always been into. I read loads and loads and loads of crime fiction, but I also in the past I've read lots of things like Terry Pratchett and stuff like that, and stuff that's kind of got a wry sense of humour. So that was the kind of style I was going, quite overwritten, very kind of narrative voice kind of led, and all this kind of stuff, and a little bit convoluted, and same sort of experience, to tell you the truth. Kind of finishing it and thinking, I'm not sure whether it's actually any good. But when I started writing the crime thing, it really, really clicked for me. And it was one of those things where I thought, it's so obvious. Why hadn't I tried to write? I read loads and loads of this stuff, and I really, really like it. And not only that, to be honest, it's probably my favourite genre of film, as well. Probably all my favourite films are from that same genre. And I just thought, why did it never occur to me to have a go at writing crime fiction? It just feels right. So I completely relate to that. But also the wonderful liberating thing is that once you realise what it is, you actually are kind of set free. And I think I can be just as creative, if not more so, within the strictures of crime fiction. Crime fiction has to do certain things. It really does. It has to start
with something that's going to get you reading, and it has to end in a way that, something bad has to happen. It has to get considerably worse, but it has to have a kind of resolution that fits the genre. Otherwise, I think you're kind of cheating the reader in that. But within that, you can go nuts. And I really love that. That idea that actually, and you talk to any, get 5 writers in a room, and you actually try and talk to them about what they're doing. You realise they're doing 5 completely different things, because it's quite, freeing, I think, that way. Do you know what I mean? As long as you're delivering on some of the points that you have to do, you can really play a lot, and you can actually, Ian Rankin's obviously the biggest cheerleader for saying how important it is as a creative genre, but and I certainly wouldn't say that about my own work, but just that sense of freedom that you get when you get there is lovely.
Well, yeah, it covers such a large scope of things. It's like most of these things. You say crime fiction, it's so many different things, isn't it? It covers so many different subgenres within that, and American crime fiction, British crime fiction, and then within that you've got tons and tons and tons of other subgenres. But as you say, it is really, really wide, and it can be as creative as you want it to be. But I think it does come down, whether it's crime fiction or whether it's something else, I think it does come down to sort of partly finding your voice, but also finding that kind of mode that you're comfortable in writing, and then that where you feel at home, sort of thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know but lots of writers write. I mean, one of the writers I was talking to last night, she does write a lot of crime, but she's written lots and lots of kind of different things, and a bit like yourself, she's written non-fiction and all that kind of stuff. But I do think you kind of have things that you kind of come back to, things that excite you, I think, as much as anything else. And that sounds like a similar thing that happened to you. It must have been a bit of a revelation when you kind of almost stumbled into it, like stumbling into the crime scene yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I called up Johnny and I said, look, the agent who'd said don't do it again said, look, I've done it again. I'm sorry. But actually I said to him, I don't think you should agent this, because you've seen me do bad work. And so he pointed me in another direction to a colleague of his. But, it was a great discovery, and it's been very freeing.
Okay, that's a good time to take a breather and grab a review in this week's Book Bloggers Corner. This week's review comes from Catherine Sunderland, otherwise known as Bibliomaniac. Catherine's been on the show before. She gives us a review of Bad Sister by Sam Carrington.
This is the BBC Book Bloggers Corner.
I have chosen to review Bad Sister by Sam Carrington. If you haven't read Saving Sophie, Sam Carrington's debut, then firstly, why not? And secondly, prepare yourself to discover a highly talented author. For those of you that have read Saving Sophie, then sit back and enjoy a second novel from Carrington that not only boasts great storytelling, but is also full of characters who are cunning, complicated and captivating. I am a huge fan of Sam's writing. I heard her speak at Bristol Crime Fest about her work within the NHS and the prison service, which was fascinating. And I've been desperately waiting for her second novel ever since I finished Saving Sophie. And Bad Sister did not disappoint. It is as compelling and as dramatic as the front cover implies. This is a story fueled by secrets, lies, dark pasts, and full of sudden twists that will ensure you'll be turning the pages until well past your bedtime. One of the main characters in Bad Sister is Stephanie, a young woman terrified for her life as her past comes back to haunt her, even though she thought that her new identity and new start meant she would always be safe. Connie Summers, Stephanie's psychologist, wants to help her confront her issues and fears, but as Connie and Stephanie try to work together to confront Stephanie's secret, Connie too is forced to confront her own dark family secrets, suddenly made even more complicated by the discovery of a mutilated body. I think the thing I enjoyed most about this book was the number of surprises and the fact that I was constantly pulled in the opposite direction from where I thought we were headed. I'm afraid I'm not a reader who is too bothered about whether I can spot the twist or guess the ending, because I love to lose myself in the writer's words, characters and their delivery of a convincing and compelling story. But if I was one such reader, I really wouldn't have seen the end coming in Bad Sister. And if we were to talk about shocking twists and stunning endings, well, this one is pretty awesome and deliciously chilling. I liked that not all the characters were who they said they were, and not all were what they claimed to be. Carrington's characterisation is very impressive. These are characters that will fascinate and intrigue the reader. They create drama, suspense, tension and emotional complications. This is a great book to immerse yourself in. It's multi-layered and includes a police procedural, crimes in the present, crimes in the past, the prison service, mental health and plenty about families. It's a great read, a perfect thriller with depth, complex characters and a storyline that weaves a wicked web that you cannot help but get tangled up in. Put yourself in Carrington's hands and prepare yourself for an explosive read.
Book Bloggers Corner.
So once again, that was a review of Bad Sister by Sam Carrington, given to us by Catherine over at bibliomaniac.co.uk. And you can follow Catherine on Twitter at Catherine Sunder, that's Sunde and the number 3, as well as finding her on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll put a link in the show notes for that too. And if you're a book blogger and want us to feature one of your reviews, be sure to let me know on Twitter or Facebook, as we'd love to have you. Just ask one of the book bloggers that's been on the show before. I'm pretty sure they have quite a lot of fun, and it's a great way to raise the profile of your blog. So getting back to our chat with William Shaw, where I asked William about one of his standalone crime books. Not everything that you do is Breen and Tozer, so talk to us a little bit about, is it The Bird Watcher, one of your other books, that's a standalone book?
That's right. I wanted to write something contemporary, having done in the 60s, and I wanted to write something about landscape. I'm quite interested in sort of nature writing, actually, which is not very crime, but I'd like that idea of setting in a place like that. And Dungeness is about 50 miles away from where I live in Brighton, and it's a place I know. And it suddenly struck me how weird it was as a place in the southeast, and it's completely contrary to everybody's idea of what the southeast is, because it's this very bleak landscape if you've ever been there. It's a huge, great shingle bank. It's about 12 square miles of shingle pointing out to the channel. And I thought, great, if I set a book there, who's going to be in it? And I suddenly sort of thought, well, it's the first RSPB bird reserve was ever set up there. It sees great bird migrations come through, and a lot of the bird nuts go there. So I thought, what if my main protagonist is a bird watcher? And what would that be about? What sort of person would live there? And why? Because it's a very antisocial place. I think people go there to be individual and to be alone. So why have you gone there? What have you got to hide if you've gone there? And I ended out with two protagonists, one of which is my hero, and the other which is the murdered person. They've both got kind of really dark secrets. And it's the sort of, that kind of came out of the landscape. But then I also made him, as I said, a bird watcher, which is a bit of a challenge, because while I'm a big fan of nature, I'm completely inexpert at it. And I suddenly thought, I can get all the police procedure right by calling up a policeman friend of mine or something like that. But bird watching's a bit difficult.
Just call Bill Oddie.
Well, it was like that, actually. I went better, I think. I called up Anne Cleves, whose husband is Tim Cleve, who is who wrote the RSPB Guide to Birds. And I began sort of getting into bird watchers as much as bird watching, and getting them to sort of give me advice. And it was a wonderful experience because, bird watchers have this really extraordinary hard-won knowledge about birds, and they are willing to share it if you're not calling them geeks, which they're not. They're great enthusiasts about this sort of stuff. And so I began sort of experiment. I'd write. In the end, I think I sent the book to 12 different bird watchers and had them come back about, could this have happened? And some of it's actually about, a weird birdie thing, which I kind of made up. But Tim Cleave said, no, it's entirely possible. And that's all you want to hear, because you don't want your stories to be about what exactly happens every day. You want them to be something that's kind of possible. And then, at one point, my detective went to see this, halfway through these investigations, he suddenly spots a bird, and I kind of put, oh, look, he spotted a desert warbler, because I knew one had been spotted there. The internet tells me this thing. So I sent it off to all these bird watchers, and they all came back to me and said, you're insane. He can't have seen a desert warbler there. I said, he can, There's been one spotted just next to this car park. He said, no, that's not the point. Of course he could have done, but that's a top bird. If he had seen a desert warbler there, he would not be fussed about solving any crime. If he's a sincere bird watcher, that's the best thing that's ever happened to him. And so they made me sort of dial down my manuscript in these, and so I really like the fact you can get experts to help you write books, because it's a bit like you can be an amateur constantly playing in other people's playgrounds, and
yeah, absolutely. Well,
they were lovely.
Well, funnily enough, again, Melanie, who we spoke to last night, which she's talked about this before, but I think a lot of people, especially when they're first starting out and they approach research, you say the internet is a brilliant resource. Obviously, we can go on there and there's tons of stuff that you can get from there. But there's not really a substitute for going, like you did, to the person, or to a person that does a particular thing or they've got a particular knowledge, and just having a chat with them. And probably similar to yourself, she's got a journalistic background, so she's really comfortable with doing that anyway. It's kind of what you would do if you were writing a piece. You'd go straight to the source, and that's part of your research that you do anyway. But it's something, and she said a lot of the time as well, you might be a bit anxious about calling them up, she said, but 9 times out of 10 they are really, really flattered and pleased that someone actually wants to show an interest in what the thing that they love or that they do.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I totally, and you're always a bit hesitant, think, and I'm, you're a bit sort of like Englishly polite, thinking, I'm very sorry, and some of it's quite serious, like the follow-up book was coming out next year called Salt Lane, is about back to immigration. Actually, it's about undocumented labor. So I need to speak to people who are working for really tough charities, working with people who are in really hard places. And you kind of think, they're going to think I'm really frivolous writing a book like this,
Yeah.
And absolutely opposite. They say, brilliant, fantastic. This world needs to be talked about. Really pleased you're doing it. And you never, exactly like Mel was saying, you will never get reactions. If you get reaction from somebody or other who's really negative about it, they're probably a bit negative about everything. Mostly, they're experts, and if you approach them in an open-hearted way, they're really keen to let other people know about their world. They've worked really hard to find this stuff out.
Absolutely, and I suppose, as you say, you take it for granted, but it doesn't really happen to them very often that somebody out from outside their world actually shows an interest and wants to know more about it.
No, I mean, like the other bit of this Salt Lane is it's set in north of Dungeness. There's Romney Marsh, which is a really ancient marshland, drained, in Roman times and onwards. It's been drained. It's sort of a hard one from the sea, and it's just an extraordinary landscape. But you can drive through it and not even notice it's extraordinary because it just looks flat. But I wanted to put a body in it, so I rang up the Romney Area Internal Drainage Board that has, which is there, but which sounds just like a real council thing, but actually it's they're following a kind of legal framework that was set up in the time of Henry II. And so I go up to these people and go to their office near Rye, and cup of tea, everything, nothing's too much. Where would I put a body if I would? Oh, body, yes, okay. And they start showing you maps and going through pages and talking, well, we found a body there and stuff like that. And, the idea of generally they're sitting there probably just thinking, oh, we've got to clear some bloody pondweed today. Oh, look, this is a bit interesting. It's something different.
Exactly, yeah. Do you think it helps as well that obviously you've kind of got a track record in the fact that you have got some books published? Because I presume a first-time author that hasn't got any books that are out in the world yet, it could be, depending on what you were asking for, especially if you were in something like that, what would be the best way to commit this crime if I was going to do it or whatever? There might be alarm bells, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I can remember first time around, I was trying to find a pathologist who talked to me about something or other. And, of course, they don't. No. Because you might be that nutcase planning to do it and they're just worried about their liability. I mean, those are the people who don't talk to you. But, it does help having a track record. And that's always, the debut is always hardest bit, isn't it? But you still, I mean, I think half the time you're holding yourself back. There's nothing, you might have to speak to 3 people before you find the one who's willing or got the time. But,
But it's worth it.
Put the boat on the other foot. I bet you're a bit expert on something, and somebody, there's probably something you have as a personal expertise yourself, and not just you, any writer, and you kind of think, how would you feel if somebody came and wanted you to share that? You'd probably be all right.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. You're right, and I mean, part of my day job is I produce videos and stuff. I have to do a lot of or make videos about all sorts of different things, but a lot of corporate videos or charity videos or whatever it is. And a lot of what I have to do is literally go somewhere and speak to somebody and interview them, on camera and find out all about their world, whatever it might be, however, left of field or, away from the norm it might be. But that's kind of part of what I have to do and learn about it. so we can make a video about it. But it is. You're right. It's a similar kind of skill, really. And most of the time, people just, if they're interested in it themselves, obviously, you do get people that, as you say, they're negative about lots of things. But in the main, if someone's passionate about something, they're desperate to talk to people about it anyway. So, and probably brighten up an otherwise boring day.
And the moment you do, you find one other little detail that sets you off in another direction. All it takes is one little thing you hear about, about the way in which they raise the water levels in summer or something, which they do there.
Mm-hmm.
They actually, you kind of think, I could use that. And, you get other little bits that just sort of work really well.
And often, presumably, a lot of the time, they're things that they wouldn't even think are worth mentioning almost. They just pass over it. Well, hang on a minute, what was that you just said? What do you do there? And I presume it can solve little problems that you might have had in the narrative, or little, how can I get around that or whatever, and they can help you out with that as well.
So much, especially in the late stages, problem solving, actually. That's the other thing that, I've been surprised if I'd told that, but it's partly because of the genre. You do find, God, so-and-so's over there, and they need to be over here, or they need to not know about that. How can I do that? And, there's it's the bit I hate most in some ways, but, it comes with the territory, is you end up with these problems and it's just like, you've got to solve them. But then again, sometimes the solution to that sets you off on another little interesting little
it's causal
track,
isn't it? It's the thing that it knocks on to next, takes you down a path that you weren't expecting to take. But on that subject, how do you actually approach your writing? Do you kind of have a set process each time you do it? Has it something that's kind of evolved over the period that you've been writing? Do you mentioned obviously with your first book you were on a train or whatever and you just started writing the book, but how do you approach it now? Do you plan it at the outset, or how do you do that?
The first one was just writing into the dark. I kind of worked out about halfway through what should have happened, and then I changed it really at the end. I had that, which I think quite a few people who do that at the beginning, they suddenly think, well, that's the person I thought was the killer, but it's not.
Yeah.
And then on my last one, I've just finished the sixth one, which I actually had as close to a plan as I've ever had, which was like probably about, generally I write about 2 sheets of A4, and that gives me a working structure, and it changes as I go, but it gives me, at least I know where I'm beginning and I'm ending, and I kind of know what the crises in the book are going to be, and then I write between. The last one I actually wrote a really long document like that, and I've discovered both the advantages and the disadvantages. And the advantage was that it allowed me to write very quickly. The disadvantages were that actually my quality of my writing was much worse, and I had to go back and add a lot more depth and grit to my writing afterwards. And the sort of thing that you normally get from not knowing where you're going. And I think it's a real playoff. And I think you talk to writers who've been in it a long time, and they tend to play between the two types of actually having a very planned approach sometimes, and then having a completely the so-called pantser approach. And they don't do one or the other always. And I think that's partly to keep yourself entertained. And it's really important to enjoy writing. And sometimes you want to enjoy it because you just want to fill in the dots that you made in your plan. And sometimes you want to enjoy it because you want to just actually, that delicious thing where you're writing something and some one of your characters starts misbehaving and does something completely weird. And it's the biggest fun ever, isn't it?
Absolutely,
that's lovely when that happens. And you kind of think, what the hell are they doing? Climbing a tree, which is what in the first book, my detective suddenly climbed a tree, and I had to work out why he climbed a tree. But I couldn't stop him; he wouldn't come down. I love that. And the other thing that I like as well, I don't know whether you find this yourself, is how sometimes your subconscious puts little things in that you didn't realise you were putting in as you were going along, and then you get to a certain point in the scene and discover that that's why I put that little bit of description in there, or that's why I had that thing that was on the shelf behind him the whole time, because he was going to do this, but you didn't know that when you wrote it. But obviously somehow some part of your brain did know, it was already thinking about, how's he going to get out of this, or what's going to happen here, kind of thing. I've had that a few times, and it's a great feeling. And you feel absolutely. Like, just for a few seconds, like, that was amazing. That's, but it is like a subconscious thing. I always talk about the back brain. I don't know whether you're the same, but, often if you get yourself into a bit of a jam, or you're thinking about a story before you start writing it even, and it kind of, you're mulling it over for days or weeks or sometimes months. And you think, well, I'm not actually doing anything. But then the next time you sit down, all of a sudden it'll click, and it's like, I know how to resolve the problem that I had now. And it is like your brain's been kind of
mulling it over for the whole time without you really thinking about it.
And I think you've got to really let yourself have conscious, let yourself do that. Really feel confident that your brain is going to do that, because it does. If you're doing it, to let especially on first drafts, leave loose ends, because you suddenly realise that you've got this situation where you can use that. That's suddenly that thing that you just wrote because it was there, and then I'll have to cut that because it doesn't really make sense. Suddenly something else happens that doesn't make sense, but you put them together and you just think, well, that works. And I love that. It's really good fun. And it is really odd. You definitely do. It's really worth going for walks. It's really worth not being at your desk, because the brain still carries on. I think as long as you've got, for me, I've got to do something every day, and even at weekends when I'm in the thick of it, I've got to do a bit every week, every day, and even weekends. I know that sounds, of course you do, but and then you get your brain into this state where it can start to think when you're doing the washing up, or when you're just going for a cycle ride or something, and you come back and you haven't even realised you're thinking about it. You sit down and you produce something because something's been churning around there.
Absolutely. How do you approach? Do you have is there such a thing for you as a normal writing day? Do you kind of have set time that you think about, I'm going to sit down now and do some words? Do you have a word target or anything like that?
I don't have word targets, but I get up and I write, and I've got I use Scrivener. I've got a word count, so I know whether I know how much I have to hit by the end of it. And if it's looking bad towards the end, I've got to speed up. But I've also, this book, I'm determined that, because sitting down's rubbish for you, isn't it? It's a really bad. It's the worst thing is you can spend a lot of time sitting down. So
it's the new smoking, apparently.
It is, but not as enjoyable, sadly. But anyway, I've decided that I'm going to start the day by doing, going out for a cycle ride or something before I start, and see whether that works. Because I love, when you're in the thick of it, I love just rushing straight to my desk, bowl of muesli, cup of tea, and cracking in on it, and then suddenly you're still in your pajamas and there's somebody at the door with a parcel, and it's really embarrassing because it's 5 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, that's a great feeling, though.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It is, but not really for health-wise. I think you've got to do something about it.
No, I know. Well, it is that age-old problem, as you say. Again, lots of people talk about standing desks and things like that now, but it's whether you can find something that's comfortable for you. But I definitely think it's a good idea to break off and do something, like go for a walk. Walking's brilliant. I find the same thing. Just walking is great for thinking through things anyway, and obviously you are getting that bit of exercise.
Most definitely, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so what's up next for you? What projects have you got in the line? You've kind of hinted that you've just finished one book and you've started another one.
I've written a book called Salt Lane, which comes out next spring. Which is one of the characters from The Birdwatcher is a woman police sergeant called Alex Cupidi, and I suddenly thought, I've written 5 books with a man as the protagonist and lots of women around them. What if I reverse that? And so it was quite interesting writing from a kind of middle-aged woman's point of view. Somebody who's wound up at Dungeness and loves the place for very different reasons from the Birdwatcher character. She's actually, well, I won't give away the spoiler, but she's quite a big figure in the Birdwatcher. So I've just completed that, and that's the Salt Lane book, which I'm very, I'm about to get the copy edit back, but I'm very, very pleased with it. It's a great start, I think, for a new series. So I've now got to start on the second one, which I want to put in the art world. I want to kind of move up the coast to the turn of contemporary a bit. And I used to write about contemporary art quite a lot, and I just want to it's a strange world with brilliant people who have to deal with very, very rich people. There's a lot of money in there, and I just think there's a lot of potential story once you get
conflict there.
Yeah. So I'm gingerly starting that. I've just written a scene, my inciting scene, which has been in my mind for a good few weeks. I won't say what it's about, but it's.
I can tell you're excited about it. Yeah, I can tell you're excited about it. That's great. So, and if people want to find more information about you, William, where do they do that, and where can they find you? You're on Twitter and the like.
On Facebook as William Shaw Writer, all one word. Twitter is William1 Shaw. That's 1 the number. as is Instagram, William One Shaw. And then my website is williamshaw.com. I was very lucky to buy that one quite early on.
I was going to say, that's pretty impressive, yeah.
I bought it in the mid-90s.
Right.
Back in the day, and I've sort of been sitting there because I was writing non-fiction books and needed a website for them.
Excellent foresight. Impressive. Well, it's been great to speak to you. Been really, really good. Hopefully you're going to stick around just for another quick little question for our epilogue episode. But for the time being, William, thanks very much for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thank you very much.
So there you go, that was William Shaw. William's latest book, Sympathy for the Devil, is out now, published by River Run. And if you love reading and books, which I'm guessing you do if you're listening to this, then you should also have a listen to William's new podcast, The Book Group, where he visits a different book group every week, every episode. And it's really interesting stuff and gives you a real insight into those kind of groups. So it's almost time to go, but of course I couldn't leave without reminding you to share the show with at least one new person this week, and to keep letting me know what you want the show to include. I'm still looking out for more book bloggers, and I'll continue to add more blog content to the website as well. So make sure you let me know what kind of topics and content you'd like to see. I'm also looking out for a regular flash fiction contest, maybe weekly, if you could let me know about that, for a new feature that I want to include in the epilogue episode. And of course, keep leaving your reviews and ratings on iTunes, please, particularly if you're in one of our many American, Canadian or Australian listeners. It'd make a huge difference to our ranking. It's the single biggest way you can help other people to find the show, and it literally takes seconds. So keep in touch by emailing us, team or Wayne at joinedupwriting.co.uk. You can find us on Twitter at JU Podcast, on Facebook, Joined Up Writing Podcast, and on the web, joinedupwriting.co.uk. So thanks for listening to the Joined Up Writing Podcast. Let's get joined up. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy reading and writing, and I'll see you next time.
Joined Up Writing.